All right. Good evening, everybody.
Is this going to be
my-
recorded so we can view it again?
yes,
I gotta,
on,
I might have to fight snow.
it'll be on the YouTube channel for Great River Greening.
What's
So, my name is Wally One, and I am a member of the Grove Sustainability Project, and I want to welcome you tonight to this event called Sustainable Lawns and Gardens, Grow Native. We're glad you chose to be with us tonight, and we're so excited to hear about your projects. Tonight, we have 4 partner organizations that have joined together to bring this to you. The first is the Grove Sustainability Project, and with me tonight is Jane Scherer-Mayer, the lead of our team, and she's helping out with technical issues. Great River Greening is a nonprofit organization and a leader in community-based restoration devoted solely to stewardship. They work with organizations, communities, businesses, and volunteers on projects. Recently, they got a grant to help the city of Maplewood restore native habitat at City Hall. Representing Great River Greening tonight is Becca Tucker and Amy Kilgore, who's providing technical support. The Washington Conservation District is a local governmental unit dedicated to land and water conservation. With us tonight is Angie Hong, Water Education Senior Specialist. And the South Washington Watershed District is a local governmental unit whose mission is to manage water and related resources in cooperation with citizens and communities. Tonight with us is Tony Randazzo from the a restoration specialist from the Watershed District. And then we also have 3 amateur native naturalists and who are going to talk to us about their projects: Dana Boyle, Lori Pellerite, and Ken Thielman. We hope to have about 20 minutes at the end for questions and answers. So if you'd put your questions, type them into the chat, that would be great. And just wanted a couple of caveats. Although all of these organizations and people are in Washington County, this information applies wherever you are. And also, if you don't have a piece of property that you can do this on, please check out your local organizations like Great River Greening and the Watershed District to see they're always looking for volunteers. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Becca.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll get some possibly screen share going here. Which screen are we seeing here, folks? Amy, are we seeing a presentation?
Yes.
Are we seeing?
Yes. Yeah, I
Perfect.
see your slides.
All right. It's always that fun first share of the evening that got to test it out and see if it works. Then here we are. So welcome. We've got over 60 people joining in. So we really appreciate you taking the time this evening on this incredibly snowy night to join us. As Wally mentioned, we're a group of a number of different organizations, all working within Woodbury, but throughout the metro, throughout the central Minnesota and Minnesota itself, to facilitate this kind of habitat restoration and just kind of make people to expand these native habitats. So without too much further ado, we will get into the evening. I think Wally gave a really great outline of what we're looking at for tonight. We've got a couple presentations by myself, Washington Conservation District, and then the South Washington Watershed District, and we've got a couple of community presenters after that. So just to start this evening out, wanted to introduce myself real quick. My name is Becca Tucker, as Wally mentioned. I work for Great River Greening. We're a nonprofit habitat restoration organization based in St. Paul. We work with communities, cities, counties, all kinds of folks to facilitate the funding, planning, and implementation of natural resource management. You're going to hear a lot tonight about how transforming areas of turf or other parcels of land into something more native can be biologically productive, something sustainable. And I just wanted to give this broad context at the very beginning to just discuss the very, any size of these projects is important. So we have everything from really any kind of native planting is worthwhile. We're talking about small triangle plantings in a garden or an area that might just be bare soil otherwise next to a house. A whole section of schoolyard that isn't serving any purpose for the kids, not even maybe 20 feet by 20 feet. And then anything from 200-acre field that might have been fallow for decades that had functionally no biological purpose besides grass, transforming into something diverse, something positive difference in rewilding and creating useful native habitat. And these projects, no matter the size, also work to increase communities' connection with the space around them. So tonight, I just wanted to start with an example. Specifically, this one's in Woodbury, since we're being hosted by the communities within Woodbury itself. And this is kind of one of the things that started this, prompted this webinar. So I'm going to talk about the Woodbury Pollinator Corridor. This is indeed in Woodbury, is owned by the city, managed by the South Washington Watershed Districts, and basically was 1 mile of mowed turf with a paved walking path that ran on top of a utility corridor. The grass was largely serving no purpose and took maintenance by the city to make it look manicured. In 2018, Great River Greening worked with SWWD and the city to recruit volunteers, coordinate the purchase of native plants in the forms of plugs and seed, and worked on converting this area from the turf that you see on the screen itself to something a little bit more interesting, which we'll see in a little bit. There are 2 different areas on this corridor that are kind of exemplary of these different sizes of restoration or wilding that can take place. So we had a set of gardens created wherever this walking path met a road on the east side of the corridor. And then the west side of the path itself was a whole strip of turf that we converted into kind of a wilder mix of prairie species, this whole length of this mile. The process took planning, a lot of great design by the Watershed District, site preparation by the city to prepare to remove the grass and prep for the planting itself, and over 50 volunteers in the rain to actually put these plugs into the ground. And it also took persistence, because it definitely takes a couple of years to get some of these projects up and running. Should have written this down, but there's a great saying that the first year plantings like this sleep, the second year plantings creep, and the third year they leap. So all of these processes take time, but here are a couple really good examples. Everything from this mowed grass to what we'll see here. So this next slide is 2018 on the top 2 pictures. So you have what one of these garden areas looked like beforehand, and then what it looked like in the absolute pouring rain after the city had prepared some of the turf, put a lot of wood chips down, and we had volunteers out planting these areas themselves. And then the picture on the bottom is just last year. The garden itself is still being established. There's a lot of work that the city and the Watershed District, as well as Great River Greening, are continuing to do to maintain these gardens itself. But you can see that right-hand side of the picture itself literally just was a stretch of turf, and now it's a corridor of wild habitat. So this example is, I think, a pretty good goal, or this corridor is a pretty good example of how small areas can make a difference. We've got everything from milkweed that provides the only food that monarch butterflies can eat, and they depend on it for their survival. We've got bee balm that provides great nectar. This odd little purple plant on the right side that is bottle gentian that does not open its flowers, but kind of keeps those closed and can only be pollinated by things strong enough to shove their way into the flowers themselves, or smart enough to kind of bite on the side of the flowers. And it also serves as habitat for all kinds of birds and mammals, and a hopscotch corridor really connecting this mile of gardens with all of the other gardens that are on this entire part of Woodbury itself. So what are the overall goals with this kind of sustainable landscaping or habitat creation itself? We've talked a lot about habitat creation. We've talked about the potential that these will have less maintenance overall. It definitely takes a lot of input at the very beginning, but overall, they're not going to have to be mowed every week. They're not going to be needing to be tended quite as much. And that's one of goal of these habitat spaces. They use space that might otherwise have just been grass. They form corridors of biology and add beauty and aesthetics to an area, as well as getting people involved in their own space. So how to participate? There's a lot of different ways that you can get involved in this kind of work. Anything from transforming your own yard. We'll hear about rain gardens in just a little bit. We'll see examples of individual patches of people's property themselves. There's also lots of ways to work with a community space owned by a church or a library or a business, or even just seeing if your city needs gardeners to tend, or as stewards to tending areas within parks. Definitely don't have to be a landowner to be part of this effort. Funding wise, you'll hear about big grants. Great River Greening works on state funding like the Environment Natural Resource Trust Fund and the Outdoor Heritage Fund here in Minnesota. But organizations like all of these watershed districts and conservation districts have grants that support neighborhood and individual home projects, all of which are worth looking into if you're interested in doing this kind of transformation. Finally, all of this work depends on the community and volunteers. This is about to be a shameless plug for some of our own events this spring, but Great River Greening, again, we're a nonprofit habitat restoration group that depends on volunteers. We couldn't do the work that we do without the hundreds of people that work with us every year. Thousands of people. And we've got a bunch of really cool projects already online for the spring. And I know that all of these community organizations have similar opportunities for people to get in touch with the spaces around them. There's also opportunities like this webinar, YouTube videos. We've got a couple on our page for things like pollinator identification. If you're not interested in planting plants yourself, but if you're interested in seeing how these areas actually transform space from turf to something a little bit more rich. And we've got all kinds of other resources, which we'll link to at the end of this evening. So with that, I'll pass it along to Angie Hong with the Washington Conservation District, who's going to talk to us specifically about rain gardens.
Awesome. That was a great start, Rebecca. And I'm excited because I remember being there helping to plant that pollinator corridor in Woodbury. And if I remember, it was a cold and windy and rainy day. So it's really nice to see that our hard work paid off and turned into a beautiful planting now. Okay, so I am going to talk specifically about water as one of the motivations that you may have for converting your conventional yard into a native garden. And specifically about rain gardens is one of the tools that we can use to create habitat, but also help to protect our lakes and rivers and groundwater resources. I'm getting a little bit of feedback, so I'm gonna real quick just mute everybody. Don't be offended. All right. And let's make sure that everybody can still hear me. Okay, seems like I'm still fine. So very often, water may be one of your key motivations for why you might consider converting a portion of your yard from a conventional lawn into a native garden. I, as Becca mentioned, work at the Washington Conservation District. It's a local unit of government that covers Washington County. So if you live anywhere in Washington County, you are in luck. You can actually go to the Conservation District website, request a free site visit, and once all this snow is melted, be able to have somebody come out to your home and walk around and give you some advice on potential planting projects. They can also talk to you about grants that are available, because as we all know, gardening can be expensive, and happily there are a lot of incentive grants through the local watershed districts. Like Great River Greening, we do host educational workshops throughout the year as well, and lots of fun family events. So then another local unit of government that you may hear about, let me just check this chat real quick to make sure that nobody's asking me a question. Okay, good. Another unit of government that you might hear about are watershed districts. So in Washington County, we are actually divided into 8 different watershed management areas. And then a number of these watershed districts actually go over into other counties. So the Rice Creek Watershed District crosses over into Ramsey and Anoka and Hennepin counties. The Ramsey Washington Metro Watershed District, like the name implies, is a little bit in Ramsey, a little bit in Washington. And throughout the Twin Cities metro area, most of the communities are covered by either a watershed district or a WMO. And the purpose of these units of government is to manage against flooding and to measure and protect water quality in the lakes and the streams. And very often the watershed management organizations will have cost share grants to incentivize things that people do on their private property, like converting a lawn to a native garden or building a rain garden. So you can see on this map where you would land if you're in Washington County, but we can definitely help you get connected if you're in a different county and want to know who your watershed is there. All right, so moving along here. I use this slide for years and have always told people that 40% of Minnesota lakes, rivers, and streams are classified as impaired. And then horror of horrors, I actually had to update the slide to say 50%, not because the water is getting worse in Minnesota, but that the Pollution Control Agency, with additional funding from the Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment, has been able to do additional monitoring of more rural lakes and streams that they weren't monitoring previously, or even to look at some contaminants of concern that they previously weren't looking at. So it's a pretty alarming statistic. We know that stormwater runoff is a major source of water pollution in urban areas, and in our suburban developments, you know, especially when we get to the time of year in a couple of weeks when the snow all starts melting, you see all this gook that's in the road. This actually carries a lot of phosphorus. It's got sediment in it. It's got heavy metals even, and road salt. So it's got all sorts of really nasty stuff that we don't want ending up in our waterways. All right, so impacts of changes in land cover. When you think of a natural system, I think a lot of us just assume that the water from rain and snow has always been running off the land and going into the lakes and rivers. But in reality, in a natural system like a prairie or a forest, the majority of the water is either soaking down into the ground or it is getting taken up by the plants. And you only have 10% of the water on average running off. And as you start developing and you add something called impervious surface, which is roads, rooftops, driveways, places where the water can't soak in, you very quickly double the amount of runoff that you have. And as areas get more and more developed, you end up with more and more runoff happening. So it's not so much that people's residential yards are so heavily polluted. It's just that we have so much more water going into the lakes and streams than used to be. And so even if you have relatively small concentrations of nutrients like phosphorus, it adds up to a lot more when you have 5 times as much runoff going into a lake. So speaking of phosphorus, this is the one that you'll hear us talk about a lot. It is a naturally occurring nutrient that's in plants, it's in leaves, it's in grass clippings, it's usually adhered to sediment. And 1 pound of phosphorus can grow 500 pounds of algae in the water. So this is the nutrient that we are very often looking at trying to capture when we ask people to plant rain gardens or to plant a native garden in their yard. And this is where you all come in, because we are calling all superheroes, people who would like to have beautiful gardens, but also have that garden be doing something really important and really beneficial for your neighborhood and for your community. And I think I saw a couple people here that are in Matamidi. This home here is one that's in Matamidi, and the flowers that are closest to the street, that's a rain garden that helps to catch some of the water that used to go down that hill and go into the basement of that house right there. So I keep mentioning the word rain gardens, and maybe not everybody is familiar with what a rain garden is. It is basically like a regular garden, but it is hollowed out a little bit, dug down maybe 6 inches deep, and placed somewhere where it will catch water either from your rooftop, your driveway, or the road. And the idea is that this gives the water a chance to either soak into the ground, be taken up by the plants, and not run off into the road, not pick up all of these excess nutrients and pollutants that we don't want in our water, and make the birds happy. So, oops, going backwards. Just wanted to share a real quick example from city of Burnsville, which there was also quite a few people in the seminar tonight that are from Woodbury. I consider Woodbury and Burnsville to be similar kind of communities, developed around the same time. And this example from a community or from a neighborhood in Burnsville was really what taught us how impactful just a few neighborhood rain gardens can be. So with grant funding, they worked with people on one street in the neighborhood, and they installed 18 rain gardens. So everywhere there's a little green blob on this map, a rain garden was put in. And then on the neighboring road, they just left it as is. So the neighborhood started with homes that look like this, and kind of your typical foundation plantings, 1 tree or 2 trees in the yard, grass, and pretty much that was it. And then they were retrofitted so that a rain garden was built in the front yard with a curb cut. So the water that is coming down the road, instead of just going into a storm drain that connects to a lake, would go into the rain garden instead. And if you are in Woodbury, you can go by Colby Lake, and there's a whole neighborhood where we've done similar projects with the South Washington Watershed District. So they looked at the data from, how much water was coming down the storm drains in these 2 side-by-side streets, and discovered that the year after the rain gardens were installed, that neighborhood had an 85% reduction in stormwater runoff just from having 18 rain gardens put in. So that was pretty impressive. If you are thinking of doing a native garden anyway, I say you might as well make it do double duty and see if you can capture some runoff while you're in the process. And this just gives you ideas of a few places that you might consider putting a rain garden on your property. So one of the obvious places would be at the bottom of a downspout. So looking at this home, there's a downspout coming off of, the right-hand side that could go to a rain garden there. Sometimes we'll also put a driveway diversion in to, maybe like a little speed bump, could be just a trench grate, something like that, so that you could take water that was going down your driveway and have it go into a rain garden instead. I just saw the question in the chat. Can you use water or a rain garden to help keep water from getting down into your basement? In some cases, yes. So that example that I showed a little bit ago of a home in Matamidi where The road was up higher than the house, and so water was running from the road down towards the house. We've done some examples where people have put rain gardens up close to the road to try to reduce the amount of water that gets to your house. It is important to note that rain gardens should always be built at least 15 feet away from your foundation, just to ensure that when you're soaking water into the ground, you aren't soaking it into your basement and aren't soaking it into the foundation. So it's going to be something that you're putting a little further away from the house in your yard. And just another example showing everywhere that you see the slightly darker green color, these are places that water is naturally running on a typical residential property and places that you could consider putting a rain garden. So just before I turn things over, wanted to share a couple more photos of beautiful rain gardens in nearby communities. And they can grow in the sun, they can grow in the shade. You just need to use different plants depending on which, which kind of habitat and what kind of situation you've got going on in your yard. But there are some really great resources. One that I always direct people to is the Blue Thumb Planting for Clean Water website. There is a very awesome plant selector tool that you can enter in your yard's condition, if it's shady or sunny, if you want a plant that grows in wet soil, dry soil. You can even say, I want it to have purple flowers versus red flowers, and it will generate a list of native plants that all will grow well in your yard's conditions. There are links to native plant suppliers and contractors, workshops and events that are happening all over the Twin Cities area. They also put on workshops about how to do bee lawns, and just all sorts of resources to help you get started building, a pollinator garden, a rain garden, a shoreline planting, anything like that. Like I mentioned earlier, Washington Conservation District, if you're in Washington County, is a really great resource as well. And you can go straight to the website to sign up for a site visit this spring. And there are a number of other resources that are on that website as well, including slides and recordings from previous workshops. Okay, so I think that was the end of my section. And I believe that Tony, are you the one that is speaking next? Kind of filling it out as we continue on our native plant journey here.
I think I am up next. So I'm Tony, and I'm from the South Washington Watershed District. Angie, though, focused on the waters, and I'm actually going to focus on the plants, which may be counterintuitive, but they're all connected, I guess is how I'd like to think of it. And so Wally asked me to talk about native plants specifically, and what kind of to define what native plants are, and then how we can think about those in the garden and how we can think about those in the urban landscape. So I'm going to share my screen. Give me a second here, and hopefully we won't need a bailout. And let me know when you can see it. Are we good, everyone? All right.
Yep.
So Wally asked me to talk about what native plants are, and I'd like to talk about what they are and why they matter. There's a lot of talk about creating native gardens and using native plants, and it's really important to kind of think about the definitions of what that means, because there are some different ways to think about it, but it's really important that you kind of come to your own understanding if you want to talk about using native plants in the landscape and you want to talk about native plants themselves. Let me monkey with my computer screen a little bit. So what I want to talk about tonight is to give a definition of what native plants are, why they're an important choice in the garden, and then I'll talk a little bit about designing with native plants and the kinds of things you want to think about when you're doing so. So I just came back from my in-laws in Italy. My father-in-law lives on the Adriatic coast, and what I was so struck by this time in Italy is we all love this amazing, beautiful landscape. The Italian landscape is really stunning. And this is looking out the back window of the house. And what I was really struck by this time is how truly human this landscape is. It's incredibly stunning. It's really beautiful. And we're so accustomed to our visions of what a beautiful landscape is. And very often it doesn't really connect to the natural world anymore. I think that's one of the things that I want y'all to think about when we're talking about getting back to thinking about native plants and native plant communities. And so what I always think about is what's changed on the landscape, and why is it important to think about what's changed on the landscape. And one of the things we need to do when we do that is we need to think about what this place looked like before roads and houses and farms and malls and turf and everything happened. All of the things all the ways in which we've made the landscape work for ourselves. And in a lot of cases, that's meant that it's sort of worked as a loss for a lot of other species on the planet. And so when we're thinking about using native plants, that's a really important thing to think about. And why is it that we would go in that direction? So what are native plants? One of the first things to think about is if we look at a map of Minnesota and we think about the landscape that we occupy today versus the landscape of the pre-European settlement. Here are two maps. One on the left is what's called the Marshers map, and that's a map of plant communities that dominated the state right around the time of settlement in about the 1850s when the Public Land Survey was done. And we can compare that to the map on the right, which is a map of the current land cover of the state. So if you look back at the map on the left, you see this big swath of yellow, and then this band of green, and then there's all this purple in the north. And what's so cool about Minnesota, I grew up in Southern California, and I thought the Midwest was somewhere flat and nothing happened. But what's so cool about Minnesota is it exists at this point where these three biomes come together. And we all know this, but so much of it has changed substantially with settlement. And so the yellow on that map on the left was all prairie landscape. That band in the middle is the big woods, and that's forests that extend really, they're very similar forests to what extends out to the East Coast, and it's a wetter climate as opposed to the West. And so we have this little finger of those woods that are more like Eastern woods. And then we have the northern boreal forests that extend up into Canada. If you look at the map on the right, you can see that big swath of yellow. And what that big swath of yellow is now is agriculture. And essentially most of that agriculture means that that's no longer that habitat that used to exist in the western part of the state. And you see those little tiny dots of red that are in that yellow. That's what's left of the tallgrass prairie in Minnesota. Those are those little tiny remnants of tallgrass prairie that are left. And so those little remnants represent kind of the habitat, the full-on plant community that remains out there, the natural plant communities that remain out there. And so it's really important to think about this in terms of how do we bring back some of that habitat to support a range of plants and animals around our region. So as you probably know, prairies are basically these grasslands with flowers interspersed. And one of the amazing things we're always asked to show these images is these deep prairie, the deep roots of prairie plants. And so most of these prairie plants have these incredible root systems, and they extend 6, 8, 10, 12 feet down into the soil. And if you compare that with the lawn, if you look at the little lawn on the left, turf lawn usually has about 1 inch or 2 of soil and very little activity that goes on below that. And so, these images of these deep roots are kind of amazing, this amazing web. As these plants establish, they send down these deep roots, those plants die, and little pieces of the root system die, or plants die, and they are what builds this incredibly rich carbon source in the soil. So we have this great organic soil in the prairie region. And if you compare those maps again on the bottom, the yellow in both of those maps is the corn belt. And the reason it's the corn and soybean belt is because those soils are amazing for growing stuff. And the reason they're so amazing is because of these former deep root systems. So we can think about who benefits. you know, there's this whole world underground that happens in natural ecosystems, and especially in natural ecosystems where a lot of activity takes place underground. So that's an important component, is building healthy soils builds this entire ecosystem underground that we often don't see. This is one I stole from Angie, actually, from one of Angie's presentations. This is a great image of a tree being blown over by the wind and sucking up that carpet of turf lawn. And you can see it's a great representation of how much those roots on a turf lawn hold on to the soil. They really don't. And so that's, yeah, it really captures it beautifully. So savannas are very similar to prairies, except that they have more woody components, often, usually in our region, dominated by oaks. And the oaks exist either as trees or as shrub and brush. And in our region, in the Woodbury area, Washington County, it was predominantly oak barrens, oak savanna, and prairie. And so when we think about restoration, very often the communities that we're thinking about in the county often tend to be those communities of oak savanna and prairie as kind of the starting point. So prairie and savanna, one of the biggest things that maintained prairie and savanna was the presence of fire and the presence of large grazers that once wandered the landscape. And in the absence of fire, oak barrens and oak savannas will often tend towards becoming more forested landscapes. And if you look at the two images here, you can see the image on the left shows a big open grown oak with those wide branches, whereas the image on the right is more of a closed canopy kind of forest where the trees are reaching and trying to get to the light as quickly as they can. So they have these big straight trunks and much more densely grown together. In the absence of fire and in the absence of grazers, what we end up with is, and in the presence of humans who have brought all of these other garden plants and other agricultural plants along with us, is we ended up with a lot of invasive species that will invade those woodlands in particular, but also prairies. And that's largely because of the absence of those disturbance regimes, the fire and the grazing. And so in a woodland setting, we have these woody species. They're predominantly common buckthorn, hazelnut, and honeysuckle, non-native honeysuckles that can really just move in and dominate. So going back to the question at hand, what are native plants? The Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, defines native plants as plants that are part of the balance of nature that's developed over hundreds or thousands of years in a particular region or ecosystem. And they put modifiers on their definitions. And when we talk about native plants, we really need to think about them as a regional thing. So if we say, is this plant native to North America? It may be. Is it native to Minnesota? Well, that's something that you need to dig a little deeper into to determine if you really want to think about what's native to your region. So one of the ways you can do that is there are great resources online. There's the Biota of North America program, which has these great range maps where you can look up most of the plants you are interested in finding out about. You're going to find listed on the BONAP page. These are linked also in the Minnesota Wildflowers page. This is a great Minnesota resource. I would recommend both of those if you're interested in learning more about any plant that you're interested in, and you start to sort of go down the rabbit hole on all of these plants. Go to these pages and take a look. So we can look at a plant like Echinacea. We can look at, we can think about Echinacea, the prairie, the coneflowers, the purple coneflowers. And there are 3 coneflowers that you typically find in Minnesota. Only one of them is native to Minnesota, even though the others are very commonly planted as native and in native plantings. The only one that's native to Minnesota is the narrowleaf coneflower, narrowleaf purple coneflower. And it's not a particularly common species of the eastern part of the state. More typical of garden plantings is the eastern purple coneflower, which isn't native to the state of Minnesota. It's more of an eastern and southern species of the prairie region, of the tall grass prairie region, but further south. So when we talk about native species, it's really important just to give yourself some background so you know what you're thinking about, because it's not necessarily wrong to sort of extend ranges of species, but it's really good to arm yourself with knowledge, just knowledge. So a few other definitions to talk about. I don't know that we want to go into the details on each of these, but invasive plants and non-native species are really important topics to cover. So an invasive plant is a plant that's both non-native and able to establish on a variety of sites. They grow really fast, they can spread really fast, and very often the problem is that they'll smother other species and will displace the ability of native species to persist. And so that has all sorts of ramifications for plant communities. Non-native plants are simply plants that were introduced or were not native to an area. We can talk about naturalized plants. Those are plants that may have been introduced and now self-reproduce and they maintain themselves, but they're not necessarily native once they're naturalized. The last one on the list is noxious weeds. Noxious weeds are a designation, a legal designation of plants that are identified by the federal government or state governments as very problematic species. Very often they're identified as noxious weeds because they're problematic to agriculture, but many noxious weeds are identified because they're a problem for in natural areas and to ecological communities and to functioning natural communities. So the land has gone from this sort of rich, diverse prairie. We shifted it to serve ourselves through the agricultural period. And then today we've sort of replaced a lot of that agriculture with these really extensive turf lawns, both in our institutions and also in our residential landscapes. And so what are some of the effects? Let's keep moving along. So one of the things I want you to think about when we look back at this sort of very quick history of the change in the landscape is I'd like to try to think about what's possible and what we can imagine as beautiful. So here's an example of a prairie down in Nebraska, this extensive 500+ acre prairie that's just extensive and it's just sort of overwhelming when you're in it. But one of the things we can start to think about is how can we bring some of that diversity back to the landscapes that we inhabit? And we've been working on, as Angie mentioned, school projects throughout the district where we have 100-acre campuses and 60% of those are just turf lawn. And there's tons of space where there's still the ability to play sports and get out and run and have classroom activities outside. But there's also a real loss of contributing to the natural world and to biodiversity and even to the education of students. So we can imagine what we might come up with if we start to shift our thinking towards a more sort of naturalized landscape that gives all those opportunities for kids, communities, and for the natural world. So it's also really important to think about who benefits when we move towards planting with native plants. There's a whole range of pollinating species. There's been lots of studies lately. There was a big study in Europe that was community driven, where citizen scientists went out and collected data on insects. And over the last 30 years, there's been a 75 to 90% decrease in insect populations. And a lot of that has to do with this shift from natural landscapes to agriculture and urban landscapes. And so these losses are important. So one of the things to think about when we're talking about designing is we want to think about supporting this wide range of species. Some of the ways to do that are to support plants throughout the year, or support those creatures, those animals throughout the year, plant flowers with long blooming periods, or plant a range of flowers that bloom from, say, all the way from April to October. So we have this long span of bloom that supports a whole range of insect species. Leave winter stems in place so that species can find habitat for egg laying, for instance, and provide plants as food. Other species that benefit are those that feed on the on the pollinators, for instance, and so that's another part of that big, larger thinking about food webs. So one of the stepping back, I probably should have said this a little earlier, but one of the things to worry about is when we talk about invasive species, there's a multi-billion-dollar effort to combat invasive species at this point. And invasive species have all of these different issues that come from all different angles. So I want to talk about one very quickly. One species that we came across when I was working at the Conservation District that we came across out in Stillwater, where we were out hiking looking for some opportunities to do some restoration. And we came across this beautiful flower, this lovely yellow flower all over through the woods, and it very striking. And something that if I was a gardener, I might say, oh, well, doesn't that just look lovely? I might like to have that in my backyard. And as we walked through the park, we saw that this lovely little flower was a bit of a problem, as it had started to basically smother everything, everything that was growing. Every surface in the park was being taken over by this plant that we figured out was called golden creeper, Ladianthia dubia. And stepping back, I suspect, and I suspect that someone on this park probably ordered this plant online, planted it in their backyard, not knowing that it would start to spread the way that it did. And it's essentially taken over the park. And this is kind of the problem when we think about invasive species, is that we don't know they're going to be invasive usually until they've already invaded, and then they're problematic. And so that's something to really be careful of when we're talking about planting in gardens. So I tend to be one that sticks to native species in my gardens and really pushes that side. And you'll get a whole range of folks that are that come from all over on that spectrum. And that's just part of the conversation. So another thing to think about when we're talking about native plants is, again, think about those range maps that we talked about. This is a great resource from the Xerces Society. It's a plant list of species that you would want to plant in the Great Lakes region to support pollinators. The Great Lakes region is a very large region. And if we're looking at trying to create sort of regionally specific plantings, we might want to look, we want to sort of look at things a little more closely and say, well, here's a plant on here that I didn't know, wing stem, Verbicina alternifolia. And the reason I don't know it is because it's not a plant that we find anywhere in this region. So its range map shows it really only extending into the central Iowa and south and to the east. And so again, this is the kind of thing you can just sort of look to as you're thinking about what it means to use native plants or to sort of understand native plant communities. So I'd like to talk really quickly, and then we'll move on to designing with native plants. And one of the big things to think about, to keep in mind, is that planting native plants is a big step in supporting the declining pollinators that we've all heard of and read articles on and talk about. And so from the smallest planting to the kind of pollinator corridors that Becca's talking about to really large scale restoration, all of it has some effect on supporting native pollinators of any region. So how do we do it? One of the big things you want to do is, if you're going to do a native planting, think about what Joan Nassar, who was at the university a number of years ago, called cues to care. And one way to sort of make it clear that your planting is something that you care about is to use hardscape and really kind of define your borders and really make a native planting a garden. I'm of the school that likes to plant densely, and, and we can talk in detail if you'd like at some point about mulch beds and how sometimes you might regret the use of a mulch bed. I find that thinking about plant communities and creating plantings that have these interacting connections between a whole range of species is something that, in my mind, can be more maintainable than doing mulch beds. One of the things to keep in mind is that planting with native species is not by definition maintenance free. It may reduce maintenance, and especially in the long term, once something's established, you may reduce maintenance, but it's not necessarily maintenance free, and you're still going to have to think about weeds and still tend to those issues. And in a prairie community, one of the ways that we can do that is we use fire as a tool to manage prairies, because that was sort of the natural management that took place over the centuries and millennia, really. The other thing we want to ask ourselves is what our perception of beauty is. Here's a project that I did when I was at Great River Greening some almost 20 years ago, up on the west side of St. Paul. And this is a planting that is predominantly native species in a front yard, converting the entire yard to a really naturalized landscape with rain garden, and then sedge type plantings. The whole front is little blue stem, and so very formalized planting, but also the entire landscape is planted to a native composition. And then we can look at it. This is the first house that I owned in St. Paul, and this is an example of thinking about scale and whether or not planting this way is right for you. So this is in the city of St. Paul. I didn't really know what I was doing, so I just planted all the big stuff and went crazy and went nuts and planted all this stuff and took this urban lot and really it's really gone quite wild. And from the perspective of using that little space in the backyard, it's this wonderful little enclosed space. But you might want to ask yourself if you want to go that far in terms of sort of keeping good relations with the neighbors. I will say the neighbors did. So you want to think about, again, thinking about scale. You look at big blue stem in the landscape. It's this great, beautiful grass, tall grass. But when you use it in an urban setting, it can become really troublesome, but also great. So I have it. This is my current house in South Minneapolis, and I've got big blue stem growing on the side of the house. And 3 to 4 times a summer, I have to come back and just shave this front edge off. Otherwise, it's just 4 feet out into the alley. So those are the kinds of things you have to pay attention to. But I also find in my tiny little yard, I find nice little surprises like monarchs that are just sort of monarch caterpillars hiding in the milkweed flower as they emerge. The other thing to do is as you become more and more interested in this is you'll start to think about this all the time. So when you go hiking, go out and every hike you take, see it as a learning experience and try to pick up as much as you can, try to learn as much as you can. The way that I do that, I have this stack of books that sits in a tub in my car all summer, and I just sort of collect and haul around these books and try to learn everything I can as I'm out in any natural areas around the state. There are other great resources that talk about. Doug Tallamy has been talked about quite a bit in the community as someone who's really pushing the ideas of why it's really important, even on very small scales, to support pollinators by really going with native species, because what you're doing is you're supporting those pollinators who are adapted to a place in particular. So to finish up, I would just like to say, when asked, don't be afraid to say why you've made the choice, because the choice is the right choice. If you're moving forward with this, you're supporting some things that are really important. And a few good reasons are just the beauty of native plant species that you'll find in the wild. And again, if you plant a really diverse mix, you can have blooms throughout the year, even if a few of those only show up for a couple weeks at a time. Those are the delights of going with native plantings and native gardens. So imagine what's possible, and every day just making an adventure, and you can have that adventure right in your little front and backyard. So thanks so much. I don't know who I'm turning it over to now. Becca,
Actually,
perhaps.
Tony, you've got a couple of questions in the chat if you
Yeah.
wanna, you want me to read them to you?
No, that might be best.
Okay. So the first one was back when you were talking about encroachment from woody species in savanna areas. Can you speak to the management difficulties of native woody encroachment? Is it harder to cut down a native maple than a Russian olive, for instance?
Is it harder? Wait, I didn't understand the last part of that, Angie.
That was my question. I can clarify.
Oh, yeah.
So I have been working on a couple projects. I'm actually down in Omaha. My mom is presenting tonight, so I got invited. But we have a really hard time convincing people to cut down encroaching woody vegetation when it's native, because they hear that it's a native species and they think, oh, it's supposed to be here, when in reality it's preventing the prairie from becoming the type of landscape that we're trying to restore it to. And so I wasn't sure if you had ever dealt with that, and if so, what considerations you might have.
Yeah, we deal with that a lot when we're doing larger restoration projects. And in a lot of ways, we have to, you have to make compromises on that. So for instance, working in woodlots in the cities that are predominantly oak, that's when it becomes really hard to cut oaks, for instance. But you just have to go through you have to go through the long exercise of saying, if you're cutting oaks, you need to justify it. One of the ways to justify the removal of oaks in particular in an oak kind of savanna, former oak savanna setting, is to say that you really need to open up that ground to provide enough light for the germination of other species. The other thing that we find is, in an oak savanna type setting, you'll have a lot of native species like black cherry that will come in and sort of fill all those gaps. And it's important to just talk about what the native plant community should look like, and what the target that you're after is. It's easier, I think, sadly, it's a little easier these days to talk about cutting things like ash, like green ash. It's a horrible situation that we're losing one of the most important North American trees, but we're losing it to emerald ash borer. On the other hand, in urban settings, ash is often seen as kind of what's called a junk tree, where it comes in quickly and will fill an entire degraded site. But oftentimes, the removal of ash now is just sort of getting ahead of it before we lose it to emerald ash borer. And so I'm working on a project in Cottage Grove now where we're restoring oak woods or oak savanna and woods to a site that really doesn't have any oaks, but it's largely trees that are sort of early successional invasive or early successional and invasive trees. So that gets easier. As far as, the conversation about how to get those to remove desirable trees, it's just a conversation you have to have, and it often is a really long conversation to have.
I guess in the interest of time,
Leave trees
Tony,
alone.
in the interest of time, Tony, Becca was suggesting that we could have our gardeners share their stories, and maybe now that you're not presenting, maybe you can pick off some of the questions directly to people in the chat. I don't know who's next. Dana, is it Dana?
There we go. Okay. Hello, everybody. Friends, neighbors, relatives. I'll give you a quick walk through the project that I've been working on at my house in Woodbury. And let's see here. One moment, please. Oh, there we go. Okay. So in a nutshell, inspiration, and you'll see photos of before and after in just a second, but I'll tell you a little bit about the background, that I was inspired. Kind of a lot of things hit me at around the same time. I attended a Wildwoods conference, and they were mentioning Doug Tallamy's Bringing Nature Home. And then his book, Nature's Best Hope, came out. He is kind of considered the ecologist of our times. Tony mentioned him and his wonderful books. I volunteered as a Minnesota Master Naturalist at the Blue Thumb booth at the Minnesota State Fair, which is part of Metro Blooms. And I had to learn more about rain gardens and native plants than I had already known, because I needed to answer questions. And then I saw my neighbor Lori Pellerite's yard. She's going to be speaking this evening too. And I thought, wow, that's beautiful. She did it. She did it in our very manicured, kind of conventional Woodbury, beautiful, but still turf dominant neighborhood. And I thought, okay, I'm going to see what I can do. So I started by deciding, well, kind of recognizing in my yard, which was all grass pretty much with a few trees, that there were some kind of marginal areas. I kind of call them the parentheses around the main part of the front yard. And these were areas where when I'd water, the water never really made that part of the grass green. It was a little out of the range of the sprinklers. In another case, there was a tree that I had to always sort of bend way down under the branches of to mow. And I thought, what would happen if I just took that part of the grass out and planted it with something that's healthier and also beautiful? So I did that myself. And I went to Gerton's, and I went to Outback Nursery, and I went to a few other native nurseries to find those plants. Then the next year I decided I was gonna really go for it. And I hired a landscape designer named Douglas Owens Pike. And if someone wants his email address, I'll put it in the chat box. But I hired him because his 30 years of landscape design and contract work was really focused on what he calls gentle transitions to natives. So I thought that really made sense for me. And he helped me sort of mentally plan the shift from turf to what's a sedge meadow or in the front yard. We decided that it needed to have the hardscapes or the cues to care, as Tony mentioned, some edges. So we put in a stone pathway in the design. And I also did something kind of radical for our neighborhood, which was to put a vegetable garden in, or suggest having a vegetable garden in the front yard, which is the only sunny spot on the property. But I couldn't just go for it, because we have a fairly vigilant and engaged homeowners association. And I had heard of people putting up fences without getting permission and then being told they need to take that fence down because it wouldn't have been approved. So that was a huge, an important process to really think about what would this be like from the homeowners association perspective if I were going to ask for their permission. And I had to know, I learned in the process that they'd already said no to some people who had wanted to put in butterfly gardens. So I thought, boy, this is going to be a challenge. And I gave them a full plan, what it was going to look like, why, what kinds of plants. I don't think everybody has to go through that, but in our neighborhood, I do think it's probably recommended, or a neighborhood like this. I applied for a Lawns to Legumes grant, which I got. It was $350, which was a drop in the bucket for the money that I spent, but it was well worth it for the educational part of learning the best practices. And they helped me choose plants. Also, the landscaper gave some great suggestions. And I was going to go with that model, which Lawns to Legumes recommends, and Tony also mentioned, which was to have that continuous blooming throughout the growing season. Usually it's planting tall plants toward the back, shorter ones in the front, get, things blooming throughout the year. And sometimes you'll see, like in my yard, it'll be a lot of reds, and then all of a sudden lots of blues and purples, and it's really lovely. Once we decided to get planting, and I'm sorry, I'm not integrating the pictures here, but I'll get to that. We decided that we were going to remove the turf mechanically rather than with chemicals, or the long process of putting paper over it and all sorts of other things. So basically in a day, the crew removed the turf with a turf cutter. And then we put down brown paper and then a big layer of mulch, natural hardwood mulch. And then we just poked holes, 1,500 of them, they did most of it, and planted the plugs of the Pennsylvania sedge. The first year, the homeowners association, well, I called them, they didn't really talk to me directly. So I went to them and asked, have you heard any complaints? And a few people had asked, are those spikes going to fill in? And yes, the answer was by the second summer, they really did. A few people were kind of making comments like, there are weeds growing through the mulch. And I sort of took that as this is a big change and it's looking kind of radical for some people's taste. In a again, conventional neighborhood where cleanliness is kind of next to godliness and keeping a trim green lawn is very important. But by the second year, and even in the first year, from a lot of passersby, neighbors mostly, people would, and many people I didn't even know, would just say, we love your yard. This is our highlight of our evening walk. Kids would come and see different butterflies and insects and hummingbirds. And so it just has been a wonderful way to connect other people and share a little bit about the benefits. So with that, here is a picture you can see on the left. Obviously, that was after I had started to work on those, as I called them, parentheses. And you're seeing it in the fall, or there's early spring, actually. You're seeing the one on the left in the early spring, but that area I had planted with some beautiful native flowering plants, but the lawn was still in the center. And then what you're seeing on the right is year number 2. So yes, those Pennsylvania sedge plants fluffed up. If you're close and you look at them, there is still space where the mulch is. So they haven't absolutely filled in, but visually they have. And the reason we chose Pennsylvania sedge is because it's a native and it doesn't grow very tall. It's supposed to grow to 7 inches and then it starts to sort of waterfall over itself. It's really, really lovely and soft. Here's a little bit, because I know it's interesting to sort of see what the process looks like. So again, on the left, this is where they started just cutting up all that turf. And there's the mechanical device on the left. On the right, this was after all the turf was gone and we had started laying down the brown paper and the mulch, and the stone pathway was put in, again, just to show intentionality. On the left, again, you'll see the beginnings of the, you'll see the part of the pathway, and then you'll see the beginnings of the vegetable garden, which was approved. The first design had a picket fence around it to protect it from rabbits and deer, although the deer haven't really, knock on wood, been a problem. But the homeowners association said no picket fences in the front yard. So instead, those taller posts were cut down at the eventually, and you can see on the right, you can probably barely see, I've just or imagine that I've got this black rabbit proof chicken wire type fencing around it. So it doesn't really stand out. And that's what the plugs of Pennsylvania sedge look like right after they were planted. Another view of that on the left, that was from the first year. And then again, on the right, there's year number 2, all filled in. These are just some little snapshots of, some of the beauty from last year. I just absolutely love the colors and the plants and then what they're attracting. And I did a few things to kind of hedge my bets. I actually got provisional funding, truth be told, from our homeowners association. And I thought, I am not taking this thing out. No way. I hope nobody on our board is on this call right now. But it is a certified wildlife habitat because it meets the requirements needed for that. I have a water feature for birds, and that was the last thing I kind of had to add. Also, because I'm in the St. Paul Garden Club and I learned about the Smithsonian's community of gardens, which would include schoolyards, churches, home properties, campuses, corporate campuses and so forth, any interesting garden can apply to be part of that. I submitted my garden for that and am in Smithsonian's Community of Gardens. So I think that, is something I can kind of fall back on. And I did drop a pin on the map of Douglas Tallamy's Homegrown National Park, which is an online map of the United States. And his concept basically is this, and this is where I'll leave you, is that there is not enough public land to make the biggest difference that we need in terms of native habitat. So if everybody can do their part and put in even a small native garden, we can become this interconnected network that he calls Homegrown National Park. So I think that's a really special and fun way to connect. Last year, I added the more flowering plants and shrubs. I can't stop doing it. It's just so juicy and fun. Filled in some shade gardens. I talked about the habitat signage and then the 2 extra special designations, which are free. And I don't even think anything's juried. So I would encourage everyone to do that. Thanks a lot. And I'll take questions at the end if you'd like.
Fantastic. Well, we've got two more speakers. We recognize we might go a little bit over, but if anyone has questions, put them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end, and I'll pass it over to Lori.
Excellent. Let's see here. Slideshow. Ta-da, there we go. All right, so yes, I live right down the street from Dana. And in fact, up here, this red Monarda came from the first conversation I had with Dana when I was walking by and said, hey, would you mind sharing some of that? So there you go. We didn't know each other before that. So gardens bring people together for sure. Well, my goal really right off the bat was to just get rid of some of the lawn. I've just really felt for such a long time that ironically, a green lawn is anything but green in the broader concept between the fertilizer and the water usage and everything else that goes with it. Lawnmowers. A lawnmower actually kicks out more pollution hour per hour than a brand new car does, which is pretty crazy. So we had kind of done a little bit of work removing small portions of the grass over on the left side, over on this side. And then in 2017, we took the plunge and went, swooped all the way down to the street. So basically this picture down here, you're seeing it from the left side of the house, and then the one up above more from the top. And I don't know how well you guys can see the mailbox garden because on my screen, all of the speakers are there, but okay. And that one is 100% natives for sure. And we were really hoping to do a rain garden in that spot because of the slope. And the landscaper I was working with felt it would be a perfect area for the holding tank, but it was this convergence of a gazillion utilities, including the cable box, and it just wasn't possible to get the big space dug out enough. So it is natives, but it's not necessarily a water garden. Then in the middle, so this space that is right here, that is my bee lawn. These are pictures of the bee lawn. I put the sign right down by the curb, so as people are walking by, they can think, oh, her grass isn't really just absolutely out of control. There is a purpose here. I do need to make some changes this coming year because the shade is just kind of encroaching more and more as the trees get bigger and bigger. And you can kind of see up here, there's not the blue blossoms and it just isn't thriving as much up there. So we got to figure something out. But in any event, that whole middle part was non-mowing, non-fertilizing. It's really a pretty fabulous setup. And then these are just some of the same little critters that are down in Dana's yard, fly down to my yard, and no doubt go back and forth and have a grand old time. I can stand at the edge of the bee lawn in June and the whole area is a buzz. You can hear the buzzing, and I can see the hummingbirds from my front window out on the Monarda, and the butterflies and other bees are always hopping and bopping about. So it was kind of take that leap of faith, the Indiana Jones, step off the curve and do something different. And I've had just a really fabulous response in the neighborhood, and hopefully it will catch on and continue to become a trend. Ken, it's all yours. Thank you.
I think it's Ken's turn. Should I go? In case you didn't want to go big, I just did a small section of my yard. Can you hear me? I'm not getting any feedback. Am I good? Somebody speak.
Yes, you're good. We can
Okay.
see it. Yeah, it looks great.
This is an old picture. It's 20 years old. I didn't have any before because I wasn't intending to give any kind of presentation. But this tree right here is now about 30 feet tall and swings around, and this area of grass just was not doing well. So I decided I wanted to do some native planting. So in the spring of 2018, I went to the Master Gardener's plant sale and talked to them and bought a bunch of native plants. I got a Joe Pyeweed, a cup plant, a false blue indigo, etc. And my intention was to just leave them in the grass and somehow control the grass in between over time. But that just became too hard to do. So I covered the entire area with fabric to smother the grass so I didn't have to do any digging. And I let the garden go. So this is September of 2018. I was a little disappointed because it looked kind of sparse, but over time, things start to go pretty well. In June of 2019, you can see it's filling in quite a bit better. I did have a rabbit problem, so I put up a fence, bought it at Menards, a little kind of decorative, and used chicken wire right behind it to keep the rabbits out. This is in June though, and I'm still kind of disappointed how slow things grow sometimes. But in August, it got better, and I kind of had some fun with it. I planted a pumpkin plant in here. So it's not strictly native. Had a little fun with that, but decided pumpkins are too hard because of stem borers, so I'm not going to do that anymore. I do have quite a bit of milkweed. 2018, you can see this is May, and again, I'm disappointed in the spring. I'm still looking for plants to give me some color in the spring. So I planted some tulips and a bleeding heart over here to try to give us some color in the spring. So I'm still hunting for that. But it grows fast. This is 2 years later from that sparse thing that I had now to a really full-blown garden. And I'm getting some volunteer plants. There's some Monarda right here that popped up. There's a cardinal plant here that popped up. I don't know where those plants came from, but they sure are kind of neat to have around. This year, I let the milkweed get a little bit too strong, and it tried to take over my grassy area. So I spent a lot of time thinning the herd, so to speak. And I got it down to last summer, a manageable amount of milkweed, Joe Pyeweed, cup plants, and some decorative grasses in the back. This is a small section of yard. It's only 12 by 24, and it seems to be doing pretty well. They are getting big. And as somebody said earlier, these are not maintenance-free yards. I'm going to have to do some thinning of the herd here eventually. And I needed to put up some sort of trellis to keep it from overtaking my driveway. Tony was talking about weeds. I hope this isn't a weed. I'm looking for early bloomers, and on one of my runs along the bike paths, I saw these plants growing real early in the spring. So I harvested their seeds, put them in the ground last year, and we'll see if they pop up nicely this year. Tony also mentioned leave the stalks up for insect habitat. So I've been doing that, except this year the snowplow got me and just wiped it right out after that big snowstorm. I even took down my fence. I had to, after that big melt, I ended up having to repair my fence. This is kind of a list of plants that I use: Joe pieweed, cup plant, bleeding heart, false blue indigo, cardinal plant, etc., that are in my garden. I had no experience. I just did it. And I hope it turns out okay. And I hope Tony doesn't give me a hard time for having weeds instead of native plants. That's about it.
Fantastic. So I know that we've got some questions. I think we had a couple people helping us out to look at the questions in the chat. So I'll throw it back over to Angie. I know you've addressed some of the questions. If you want to speak to some of the things that you've talked about.
Yeah, let's see. I was trying to pick off the ones that I knew the answers to. Question about good plants for a mostly shade rain garden. And I realized I thought I had shared all of the slides from my presentation, and somehow I had managed to skip a couple. But the Board of Water and Soil Resources, for their Lawns to Legumes program, they do actually have some native garden templates for shade and sun. So if you go to their website, you can find these nice, they're kind of like paint by numbers, except it is a garden. So I'll just real quick show you what they end up looking like. This is an example of a paint by numbers design for a rain garden, and then I dropped a link in the chat for a design for a shade garden that also attracts pollinators. And just some other suggestions for native plants. What kind of root structure does a bee lawn have? It's not going to be the super deep roots like what you're finding with the prairie plants, but most bee lawns have clover as one of the species, and those are nitrogen fixing and very fibrous, good roots. So not going to be as deep as a prairie, but it's definitely providing more benefit than a traditional lawn. I don't know if you know the answer, Tony. There was a question back here about coneflower that I don't know the answer to.
No, I don't know the answer to that.
No, I know.
That's a
I even
horticultural
tried the old
question
Google in the background, and it couldn't help me out either.
Yeah, I think that's a horticultural question or a
Yeah.
pathology question. Yeah, that might be something for master gardeners or for someone in extension on the horticultural side.
Yeah. Consider joining the Minnesota Native Plant Society. Yeah, that's awesome. Wild Ones is another good group for native plant enthusiasts, and they will have monthly presentations from people talking about native lost my ability to speak, landscape restoration. And the Master Gardener Plant Sale is Sunday, May 22nd, 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. at the Washington County Fairgrounds. I have bought many of my own native garden plants at that Master Gardener Plant Sale. And let me tell you, it is a great place to get a lot of plants very inexpensively. So, you have to wait a little bit. If you are ready to go first thing, then you can't use that as an option, but it's a great one to get inexpensive lots of plants.
And I would like to do a quick plug for the Watershed District and our cost share program. But the way to get in touch with that cost share program, really the way to get started with that is what Angie mentioned, which is to go on the Conservation District's webpage and sign up for a site visit by one of the Conservation District designers. And they can come out and assess your yard. They'll do some analysis to find out if a rain garden is something that will work or otherwise you can just do a straightforward native plants planting. And we at the Watershed District have a $500 plant grant that's available for reimbursing for all the materials that you might want to use to go native in your yard. That number really bumps up considerably if you can get phosphorus reduction, and that might be something you can do through the installation of a rain garden. And that, we go through a modeling process to determine how much phosphorus benefit there is. And that's, our program offers up to $5,000 per pound of phosphorus removed. And so typically, if you just want to do a native plant garden, give a call, contact the Conservation District through their website, and get a visit in. So, Angie, if you could put the link up for the Conservation District, because I know you have it at your fingertips.
Here I am unmuted. Yes, I did put it up. It is three back in the chat behind the most recent ones from Amy and Jane. Yes.
It's so hard to believe, but those beautiful plants are going to be coming up pretty soon. Oh my gosh, I can't wait. It almost seems like it's too much to hope for.
I know. I did actually just see a photo somebody had shared on like the Minnesota Naturalist Facebook page of skunk cabbage. Did you see that,
Yeah.
Becca?
Yes.
Skunk cabbage was starting to come up somewhere near here, and I thought, no, yes, but no, how can it be happening so soon? Yeah. I did just hear robins singing yesterday too, so that made me pause and stand and smile for a really long time. Yeah. They're coming.
I think too, I'm just going to add this, we learned a lot tonight, which was great. I really appreciate the Grove for pulling this together. It's just so nice that you guys are doing this. And I think too, there is that need to sort of stick together on the cultural side of this whole deal, because what we're doing, it depends on where you live. I mean, Tony, you live in South Minneapolis. This is sort of the way people do it there. Stillwater, I feel like the same way. And a lot of people are in areas where you can kind of do what you want. But when you live in a more conventionally groomed area, it's a culture shift. This is something that people hold on to because it's just the way it goes. And lawns, I learned this loving the green lawn comes from the British Isles, where they have a lot more rain all the time, and it's showing landed gentryship and all sorts of symbolic stuff. So what we're doing is changing culture, and that sometimes gets people a little annoyed. And that's why sticking together and being part of these groups, whether it's church or plant society or master gardeners or master naturalists or water stewards or whatever, is really helpful, because we kind of need each other to keep going, I think, sometimes.
Well, and with that, I think we're at our time, but we definitely have, I think our folks will stick around if anyone has any other questions. You can see in the chat, we have the more information on the Grove Sustainability Project, which again, pulled this webinar together tonight. We also have a link to, it's a tiny URL. It's a Google form, which basically just collects simply your name and email. If you're interested in getting the resources that we talked about, I know we talked about a heck of a lot of things, but we're going to send out to anyone interested a document with all of the links, a bunch of more information on the watershed districts, as well as the plant resources that we talked about tonight. Also, a link to the video itself will be in that document if you fill out the Google form. This will also be hosted on the Great River Greening YouTube, which you can get to just by going to YouTube and searching Great River Greening. You should be able to find our page in case you want to share this with other folks later on, or for whatever reason, watch an hour and a half of folks talking about native plants again, just to get you a little bit closer to spring. So unless anybody else has anything to say, just gonna quick check the chat. We really appreciate everyone joining tonight. and hope to see green growing things soon. So thanks again, and we'll stop the recording. Well, keep going. If anyone's got any questions, we'll be here for a little bit.
Well, thanks to everybody who helped put this together and everybody who attended. I think this was great, gets us excited about spring. For my closing, I just like to read a portion of a poem by Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk and poet who died last month at the age of 95. And he said, "The gentle spring rain permeates the soil of my soul. A seed that has lain deeply in the earth for many years just smiles." And I think that sums up what we're all waiting for. Thank you.
Yep. Take care, everybody. Good to
Thanks,
see you all
Wally.
here.
Great parting words.
Stay in touch.